Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, Ninj, and right now Americans are watching the same war, but hearing two completely different stories. You turn on one network, and you're told that this is a necessary confrontation with a hostile regime that has spent decades threatening the United States and its allies. And you flip the channel, and suddenly the same conflict becomes reckless escalation, a dangerous slide towards another endless Middle East war. There's two narratives on the same battlefield, and it's completely different conclusions. But here's the part that most of the coverage is missing. This story isn't just about Washington and Iran. It's also about the Iranian people themselves, because these governments trade missiles and political commentators argue on television panels, but millions of ordinary Iranians are reacting to the conflict in ways that do not always match up with the official rhetoric coming from their leaders. Some are rallying around their government in response to foreign attacks, and that's because when a regime is in place, there are people that support that regime because there's people who benefit the regime. They serve the regime. You're always going to have people who support the regime and are against any kind of transition of power. Others are hoping the pressure might weaken a regime. They have protested against this fucking bullshit regime for years, the Iranian people. Outside the country, Iranian communities around the world are watching closely, many of them openly debating what the future of their homeland should look like. And that is where the story gets real complicated, because the truth is that this conflict can't be understood through headlines alone. It can't be understood through partisan talking points, and it certainly can't be understood if we pretend the history of the relationship between Iran and the United States began last week. So tonight, we're going to slow down and we're going to do something modern news cycles rarely do. We're going to step back and we're going to look at this conflict through three different lenses. So first, the historical roots of the confrontation between Iran and the United States, because the story stretches back decades, and understanding that history changes how you see present day, Second, we're going to go and take a look at the reaction inside Iran itself and among Iranians living around the world, because the Iranian government and the Iranian people are not always speaking with the same voice. More often than not, they're not even speaking with the same voice ever. And the third thing I want to go over is we're going to examine the informational war that's unfolding here at home and abroad. The stark difference between how conservative and liberal media outlets they're framing this conflict and what that tells us about the battle over public perception. There's three perspectives, three very different ways of looking at the same war. And in the end of this episode, you may not agree with every conclusion, but you will understand why the story you're hearing depends so much on who is telling it. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand something that the 24-hour news cycle almost never explains, and that this war didn't begin yesterday, it didn't begin last month, and it certainly didn't begin with the latest missile strike or the latest political speech that somebody gave. The roots of this conflict goes back more than 70 years. To understand the hostility between the United States and Iran, you have to start in 1953. At that time, Iran was led by a prime minister. He was a nationalist leader who made a decision that sent shockwaves through the global economy. This guy moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had long been controlled by Western companies. And for many Iranians, this was a matter of their sovereignty. So they felt like, what the Western companies were imposing or taking their wealth away. So, how Islam does, they came in and they took it back from the Western companies. So for Western governments, it was seen as a direct threat to their strategic interests. And the United States and the United Kingdom supported a covert operation that ultimately removed this guy from power and restored the Iranian monarch to power. The Shah is what he was called, and I'm not even going to try to say his name because I'm going to just butcher it. So the Shah ruled Iran for the next 25 years, and he was pro-Western. They were an ally to Western civilization. And under his leadership, Iran modernized rapidly and maintained close ties with the United States. But that modernization, it came with a cost. It was political opposition from the Islamic Party inside of Iran. That political party opposed everything that was going on. So they were also suppressed by the government, and dissidence was punished. And many Iranians came to believe that their country was being run by a monarch, um, backed heavily by foreign powers, and they hated it. They felt like the West had too much of a hand in Iran. So by the late 1970s, the pressure reached, a boiling point, and things started to break. In 1979, a revolution swept across Iran, and millions of people took to the streets, demanding the end of the monarchy. The Shah fled the country, and a new political order emerged under the leadership of Ayatollah dead guy Khomeini. That moment changed the course of Middle Eastern politics for decades to come. So Iran transformed overnight from a pro-American monarchy into an Islamic republic openly hostile to the United States and much of the Western world. But the moment that permanently burned the hostility into American memory came later that same year. In November of 1979, Iranian militants stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They seized 52 American diplomats and citizens and held them hostage. Those hostages remained in captivity for 444 days. For Americans watching on television, night after night, the hostage crisis became a symbol of humiliation and anger. For the revolutionary government in Iran, it became a symbol of defiance against what they saw as decades of foreign influence in their country. So during this period, the slogan "Death to America" became a central piece of revolutionary rhetoric inside of Iran. And many people on TV who have fled Iran talk about this. Yeah, we were forced in elementary school to say every single day, "Death to America." It still resonates in my head. And it would, hearing, like we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance every single day. That still resonates with me. I could only imagine them shouting "Death to America." But moving on. So from that point forward, the relationship between the two countries, it was defined by confrontation. Sanctions were imposed by the United States, diplomatic relations collapsed, and Iran began building alliances with militant groups and political movements across the Middle East that were basically anti-Western living, Western civilization, anti-American. So over the decades that followed, the two nations rarely confronted each other directly. Instead, conflict played out through proxy wars, intelligence operations, and economic pressure and regional power struggles. And that's why we've been involved over there for so freaking long. American troops would encounter Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. The Israeli forces would battle groups supported by Iran in Lebanon, the Houthis. Missile programs, they expanded, sanctions tightened, and every few years the tensions would flare up again. So when you hear people say that this war came out of nowhere, they need to understand, and everyone needs to understand, that what we are witnessing today, it's not an explosion. It's the latest chapter in a conflict that's been building for generations. And if you don't understand that history, you can't fully understand the war unfolding right now. Now, here's a distinction that the Western liberal coverage completely misses. When Americans hear the word Iran, they often imagine a single, unified voice, a nation speaking with one message, one ideology, one set of goals. That assumption is wrong. Just look at America itself. The Iranian government and the Iranian people are not always aligned. In fact, in many moments of crisis, the gap between them becomes impossible to ignore. Right now, as this war unfolds, the reaction inside Iran itself appears deeply divided. On one side, you have citizens who are rallying behind the government in response to foreign attacks. Like I said, there's always going to be people who benefit from a regime, and those are those people. For many people, though, inside the country, the side of America or is Israel striking them, it triggers a powerful nationalistic instinct. Regardless of their views on politics, when bombs fall on their homeland, they see an external enemy. That reaction, it's not surprising. It shouldn't surprise anyone. This is what happens in most countries during a war. But there's another reaction that's happening at the same time, which is not, it wasn't expected by the liberals. Videos that are circulating online that show groups of Iranians responding very differently to the news of the regime and the figures that are being killed right now. In some cases, People were seen celebrating in the streets or sharing messages online expressing hope that pressure on the government could eventually lead to political change. So, for years, Iran has experienced waves of protests against its leadership and demonstrations over economic hardship, political restrictions, and their own personal freedoms that have repeatedly challenged the authority of the state. And I don't know if you heard, you should have if you're up on any kind of news, but they killed 46,000 people in January just because they were protesting. And this isn't the first time. This is one time of many waves of this, many cycles of this that have happened. That's just the latest chapter. Again, those tensions, they don't just disappear when this war begins. They simply move underground. And if you step outside Iran's borders, the divide becomes even more visible. Among Iranians who fled Iran, the reaction has been unmistakable. Exiled Iranian communities across Europe and North America and other parts of the world have held rallies openly calling for regime change. Many protesters argue that the Islamic Republic has ruled the country through repression for decades, and that the current crisis could eventually open the door to a different political future for them. These communities include people who fled Iran after the revolution, families who left during later crackdowns, and younger generations who grew up inside the country but remain deeply connected to its politics and don't agree with the way that they're going. For them, the conflict is not simply a geopolitical struggle between governments. It is also about the future of the country they consider their home, because that's where they're from. This is the part of the story that often disappears in the simplified narratives we hear on television, because the reality is this war is not simply America and Israel versus Iran. It's also a struggle inside Iran itself about what the country will become in the future. A battle between the government determined to maintain its power and segments of the population that have spent years questioning that power is unfolding right now. And understanding that inner conflict changes the way you see everything else happening in this war, because when missiles fly and governments make threats, the people living under those governments are not always thinking the same thoughts as those leaders speaking in their name or speaking for that population. Now, let's talk about the moment in this war that forced the Iranian government to change its tone, because Iran did something it almost never does, and that's apologize. Iran apologized. The Iranian president, Pezeshkian, I don't even know how to say that. I'm sorry, but I'm really not sorry. Issued he issued a rare public apology to neighboring Gulf nations after Iran missiles and drone attacks struck countries across the region during the conflict. We bombed them, and they just started indiscriminately bombing everybody. And the reason for that apology, it's simple. Iran's retaliation didn't stay contained inside of its borders. It spread across the entire Gulf. Iranian forces launched missiles and drones towards multiple targets across the region, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and others. Across the Gulf region, air defenses scrambled to intercept incoming projectiles, while explosions rattled cities that had hoped to stay neutral in this conflict. And suddenly Iran had a serious problem on its hands, because the moment those countries were pulled into the fight, the war risk expanded into something far larger than what it was before. Gulf nations that had previously tried to stay out on the sidelines, they're now under attack. So some of them host major American military bases. Others are key global energy producers. And you know how Trump feels about the energy producers right now. What Iran did is it dragged these other countries fully into the war, and it could have turned into a regional conflict, into a coalition war overnight against Iran. So the president of Iran, understanding this, not being completely retarded, he stepped forward and delivered a message that's rarely heard from the Iranians. He apologized to neighboring countries for the strikes that he said Iran would suspend attacks on them unless their territory was used to launch operations against Iran, which, like I said, many of those territories host American military bases. So the message, it was clear: stay out of the war and we will stop firing missiles into your airspace. Don't allow America to use your land and we won't fire missiles over there. But inside Iran, that apology landed like a political bomb because the hardline factions inside the government erupted into anger. The elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps pushed back against the president's statement and warned that Iran would continue attacks if neighboring countries allowed U.S. and Israeli forces to use their territory to land, refuel, rearm themselves. That reaction tells you something extremely important, though, because when governments begin arguing within itself during a war, it usually means that the pressure from the outside is working. The apology exposed something analysts have been watching pretty closely, and that's Iran's leadership is not moving in perfect unity right now. There are divisions, there's fractures, and there are competing visions inside the Iranian power structure about how the war should be fought and how far it should go, and what the end looks like, and what surrender even looks like, probably, because I would imagine they're starting to think about that the way that they're getting pounded. But one faction in Iran appears to understand that expanding the conflict across the Gulf area could bring multiple countries into the fight against Iran, and that wouldn't be good for them. They probably couldn't handle that since they can't even handle what's going on right now. And then the other faction, it believes backing down even slightly damages the revolutionary image and that the regime has spent, more than 4 decades protecting to the world, not realizing the already tarnished image their lack of defense capabilities has already shown the world, that they can't do it. You ain't nothing when America comes in. Venezuela showed the exact same thing, but when those two instincts collide inside of a government built on both, religious authority and military power, the result is a fraction. It's friction within the government. That friction is one of the most important signals coming out of this war, because wars do not only reshape borders, they reshape governments. They expose the internal cracks. And right now, the pressure of this conflict appears to be sending shockwaves directly into the power structure of the Islamic Republic itself. Now, while missiles are flying across the Middle East, another battle is unfolding right here in the United States, and that's the battle over how Americans are supposed to understand this war or perceive this war. And if you listen to much of the liberal media coverage on the conflict, you will notice a very specific pattern. The first theme is escalation. Almost every discussion begins with the same warning. Commentators raise the possibility that the conflict could spiral into something larger. They talk about the risk of a regional war and possibilities of other countries getting involved, and the danger of the United States becoming trapped in another prolonged military engagement. The message is fear, as usual, that this war could get out of control. The second theme centers on presidential authority. Again, as usual with the Democrats, they're always trying to feed on these hypotheticals. So many liberal outlets have spent significant time questioning whether the president should have launched military operations without additional approval from Congress. The discussions about the War Powers Resolution and constitutional authority quickly become part of their narrative, even though Democrat presidents have used the same powers in the past with no questioning at all about overreach at that time. Instead of focusing primarily on the battlefield, the conversation has shifted towards legal processes again and political oversight. Then comes the third theme: American and civilian casualties. Coverage frequently emphasizes the human cost of the conflict. Reports highlight destroyed infrastructure, injured civilians, and the broader humanitarian consequences of air campaigns, plus the loss of the American soldiers due to the action taken by the U.S., right? 6 American casualties thus far in the campaign. In a war, people get hurt and people die. This is something that they haven't really complained about in the past when we've waged war or continued wars underneath Democratic presidents. So those concerns, they're real. War always carries human costs, and it's sad. But it's also something that if you have a brain in your head, These are the costs that get paid. And you learn that, I think in elementary school when you start learning about war, period. But when that becomes the dominant frame through which the entire conflict is interpreted, it changes the way the liberal mind perceives what's happening because they're so easily influenced, right? Like they blow like the wind. So there's the warning that echoes through almost every segment, and it's the fear of another endless Middle East war. And they're trying to sell that really, really hard. So for many commentators, the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan, they loom, over every discussion about Iran. The argument is about once the United States becomes deeply involved in a conflict in the region, it can take years or even decades to unwind based off of, our past struggles. But I think Trump knows this and is making huge efforts to end this conflict quickly. But just be gracious and give him some time. This is the very beginning of the war. We're not 2 weeks into the thing. The question they keep asking is simple, and there's enough gray area to make a liberal nervous. Are we walking into another long-term war without realizing it? Put all those themes together and you start to see a narrative structure. It's escalation, legal authority, humanitarian consequences, and the fear of a prolonged conflict. They're always selling fear and hypotheticals. From that perspective, the war is framed less as a strategic confrontation and more of a dangerous gamble that could destabilize the region, and it pulls the United States into something far larger than anyone intends because of Israel, according to their framing, which is a narrative that they intend to keep pushing. So whether you agree with the interpretation or not, it's one of the dominant lenses through which a large part of the American media landscape is currently viewing this war on both sides of the aisle. So if you look at the other side of the American media landscape, because if liberal outlets are framing the war around escalation and risk, conservative coverage tends to focus on something different, the long history of the threat itself, right? Like I've been framing it myself even. In conservative media, discussions about Iran rarely begin with the latest missile strike. They begin with decades of confrontation and actual understanding of what the conflict is about. Iran's support for militant groups across the Middle East, its development of missile programs, its backing of organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and other regional militias that have challenged American allies for years. From this perspective, the war isn't a sudden crisis. It's a delayed response for a long-building problem. That narrative, Iran is not simply another country caught in geopolitical tension. It is viewed as a strategic adversary that has spent decades testing the limits of American restraint, while we practice deterrence. Conservative commentators frequently argue that one of the most important goals of the war is to restore deterrence. The idea that our adversaries must believe the United States will respond to them decisively when its interests or its allies are threatened. It's pivotal to power projection. We allowed them to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis for years. And for years, critics argued that Iran had grown increasingly bold, launching proxy attacks and expanding its influence across the region while facing limited consequences from the rest of the world. So when America and Israel, we started striking them and began hitting the Iranian military and infrastructure, the conservative coverage framed those operations as a necessary signal, a message not to Tehran, but to every government watching. The balance of power in the region is happening. The rebalance and the reshuffle is happening, and it's happening now. Then comes the third theme with conservatives, and that's the military capability, and rightfully so. Coverage often emphasizes the scale of effectiveness of American and allied operations. When we work together, we're impervious. The reports highlight the destruction of missile launch sites, command facilities, air defense networks, and other strategic assets, along with the death of Khomeini and their next set of leaders. and their next set of leaders. The focus is not simply on the act of war, but on the demonstration of overwhelming military superiority. Trump is catching bodies all over the world, guys, and our enemies, they're noticing. Um, there's a broader ideological argument here. There's many conservative commentators that frame the conflict as a confrontation with a government that has openly opposed American interests for more than 4 decades. From the hostage crisis in 1979 that we talked about to the proxy conflicts that have been taking place all across the Middle East, the Iranian regime has repeatedly positioned itself as an adversary to the United States. So the war is not viewed as reckless escalation by us conservatives or us MAGA people. It's seen as an inevitable confrontation of a regime that has spent decades challenging American influence and supporting forces that destabilize the region. Put all that together, and you begin to see the difference in perspectives of a liberal and a conservative. Where liberal coverage often asks whether the war might expand, conservative coverage often asks why the confrontation took so long to begin in the first place. There's two narratives here, two completely different interpretations of the same battlefield. Now, if you step back for a moment and you look at what the rest of the world is seeing while this war unfolds, because the audience for this conflict is not just the American public. America's adversaries are watching very closely, and they're not just watching the battlefield, they're watching the results. Earlier this year, the United States carried out dramatic military operations in Venezuela. In a matter of hours, American forces launched coordinated strikes, suppressed defenses, and removed Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro from power in a tightly executed operation involving intelligence assets, air power, and special operator units. We kidnapped the president of a country and brought his ass back home so that we could put him in front of a judge. The message from that operation is unmistakable that the United States demonstrated that it could reach deep into another country and dismantle a hostile regime's command structure with speed and precision. And now, only months later, the world is watching something even larger unfold: Operation Epic Fury. The governments around the world are watching, guys. In Moscow, the Kremlin is studying what this level of American power projection means for the war in Ukraine. Russia has already been fighting a grinding conflict for years, and the demonstration of rapid American strike capability sends a message about what a direct confrontation with the United States would look like, and it isn't something pretty. And it's going to make anybody think twice. In Beijing, the Chinese military planners are watching carefully as well. For years, China has talked about the possibility of bringing Taiwan under its control, even by force if necessary. But when American forces demonstrate the ability to move rapidly, strike thousands of targets, and dismantle sophisticated defense systems, the strategic calculation changes. Most of the systems in Iran were either from Russia or China. All systems in Iran exist no more. So every Chinese general looking at a map of Taiwan has to ask the same freaking question. If the United States can dismantle Iranian defenses this quickly, what would happen in the Taiwan Strait? That's the real audience for this war. Military power is not only about the battles you fight, it's about the battles you prevent. It's about deterrence. Deterrence works when, potential adversaries believe that the cost of confrontation will be overwhelming. It's called peace through strength, like Trump says. Right now, that calculation is happening quietly in command centers across the entire world. In Russia, as the war in Ukraine drags on, in China, as it considers the future of Taiwan, and in every government that has spent years testing the limits of American resolve. What do you think Kim Jong-un is thinking in North Korea? If we came in and we swooped on Maduro, you don't think we could swoop in on North Korea, Kim Jong-un? I think we can, and I think they think we can also. We're sending messages with every radar site destroyed, every military missile base that's eliminated, every command center taken offline. It sends a message far beyond the Middle East. The message is that American power, when it decides to act, can move with enormous speed and force. And whether people support the war politically or criticize it, one thing is certain: America's adversaries are watching, and they're thinking very carefully about what they just saw, and rightfully so. Now, there's one more battlefield in this conflict that doesn't appear on the military map, and it's the information battle. Because modern wars, they're no longer fought only with missiles, drones, and jet fighters, okay? They are fought with narratives, headlines, video clips, and algorithms, and the liberals have figured this out: why they sow so much division using fear. This conflict is not just about a military war, it's an information war. Governments are trying to shape how the populations understand the conflict. Journalists are racing to report facts about competing interpretations of these facts, and they're flooding the news cycle. Activists with, political organizations and online campaigns, they are all pushing their own version of what this war means, including myself. No different than this show. I just try to approach the facts and present the facts to you in a way that's not liberal, because I'm not liberal and I never fucking will be. So if you're here for that, I don't know why you would be. But on a social media scale, the battlefield becomes even more chaotic, because videos appear online claiming to show successful strikes with, other clips appear that are claiming the opposite. And some of them are real, and some of them are even old footage from previous conflicts that are recycled and reposted as a misrepresentation of this conflict itself. Some people are manipulated, and some people aren't. And it's the people that have a brain and the people who don't that make these different sides of the scale. The goal is simple, and it's control the narrative, because whoever controls the narrative often controls public opinion. The winner no longer tells the story, and division is the theme in the 21st century, okay? So inside Iran, this information war is even more intense. The Iranian government maintains some of the strictest internet controls in the world. Websites are censored, social media platforms are restricted, and online communication is monitored constantly. During moments of crisis, the government has taken an even more dramatic step, and they just completely shut down the internet to civilians. Large portions of the country have experienced internet disruptions and blackouts during the conflict, cutting civilians off from outside reporting. They're only getting inside reporting, and making it extremely difficult for independent journalists to verify what's happening inside the country. Unless you're CNN, because the Iranian government knows they will frame the war in the dictatorship's favor and have liberals in America marching for literal oppression. But that's a whole different story. When the internet disappears, the outside world loses its window into the events on the ground. Videos stop flowing, eyewitness accounts disappear, and the information that does reach the public often comes through the state-controlled media lens, CNN. But the information war is not only happening inside Iran, it's happening right here in the United States. Some commentators, they focus on the destruction of Iranian military infrastructure and the restoration of our deterrence and projecting strength through peace. And then the others, they focus on potential humanitarian consequences and the danger of escalation. The facts may be similar, guys, but the interpretation of those facts become a battlefield of its own. And that battlefield matters, because wars are not fought with weapons. They're fought with public opinion, and perception drives opinions. Framing the information is imperative to drive a narrative. Political leaders must answer to voters, right? If you're in a democracy, governments must maintain support for military operations, and adversaries watch very carefully to see whether a country appears unified or if it's divided, because you can tell a lot by the reaction of the people. That's why the narrative struggle matters so much. Every headline, every viral video, every political speech becomes part of the larger contest over how this war will be understood. Missiles may decide, what happens on the battlefield, but the information war often decides what people believe about why the war happened in the first place, right? In the 21st century, that belief can shape the outcome just as powerfully as the weapons themselves. China's watching. An attack on the wide views of the American people is a vulnerability of this country we need to take into account. Heaven forbid we go to World War III or a direct conflict with Russia or China or even one of our allies. Who knows? The world is constantly changing right now. We have no idea what the future brings. The war on the battlefield of the mind is being fought right now, and these divisions are more than skin deep in America. And anybody paying attention can see that. So, after all of this, step back and look at the full picture, because the truth is that several forces are colliding at the exact same moment. History is colliding with present-day geopolitics, military force is colliding with political narratives, and the information war is colliding with the battlefield itself. The Iranian regime has spent more than 4 decades defining itself through confrontation with the United States. From the revolution in 1979 to the hostage crisis to proxy conflicts all across the Middle East, hostility toward America has been woven into the identity of the Islamic Republic. And a large population of Iran does not carry that same sentiment. At the same time, Iranian people themselves are not a single unified voice. Some rally behind the government when foreign bombs fall on their country, and others quietly hope the pressure might lead to a different future for them. The divide inside Iran is real, and it has been growing for years. The United States, and within the United States, there's another divide, shaping how the war is being understood. Turn on one network and you hear one story. You turn on another, you hear a different. The truth is, the story unfolding right now can't be understood through only one lens, because the war is not just about missiles and airstrikes. It's about perception. Again, it's about the deterrence. It's about governments around the world are learning as they watch all these events unfold. It's about making a statement. While Americans debate, the politics of the moment, leaders in Beijing and Moscow and other capitals are studying something completely different. They're studying capability. They're studying response time. They're studying the scale of American power when it decides to move. Because the lesson that American adversaries take away from this moment will shape the decisions that they make tomorrow. Whether that lesson is caution or confrontation, today will determine what the next conflict looks like tomorrow. That's why understanding the narratives around the world matters just as much as understanding the war itself. This has been the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, Ninj. Visit 4547blog.com, join the free blog, purchase some conservative apparel, and read the annual blogazine, now free for all to read. Stay sharp, stay informed, and stay vigilant. We'll see you next time.